Willowbrook hepatitis study. In the 50s and 60s, a group of researchers thought that the best way to study hepatitis was to use them on vulnerable children in the Willowbrook State School in New York. Now, this wasn't just a regular school, but an institution for children with intellectual disabilities. Essentially, studying hepatitis in children who already had disabilities was double jeopardy for them. What they did was that they mixed hepatitis with the children's chocolate milk. If you were one of those kids, you'd think it's just a normal school day. Instead, you'll get a healthy dose of chocolate milk with a dash of hepatitis. The researchers, of course, tried their best to wash their hands clean of the mess. They explained that the school was already a breeding ground for hepatitis because of its poor sanitary condition. So for them, it only made sense to conduct the study in that school. They also argued that the study would help them create a vaccine that would ultimately benefit those kids. Students who were infected by hepatitis recovered from the disease. On top of that, they developed immunities to future hepatitis outbreaks. So in a sense, the study was beneficial to them. The problem was that, at the end of the day, it was unethical, terrifying, and misleading because neither the parents nor the kids knew what was going to happen to them. Dr. Leo Stanley experiments. You're locked in for life at the San Quentin State Prison, and you think that this is already the worst thing you could ever experience. But a fellow named Dr. Leo Stanley walks in and decides there's still something worse than spending an eternity in prison. Stanley, the prisoner's chief surgeon, thought it was okay to use prisoners as guinea pigs for his experiment. Of course, because he was working in a prison, no one was going to tell him, "Yo dude, that's not cool." So Stanley did his best mad scientist impression by taking testicles from executed prisoners so that he could transfer them to living inmates. He did this for decades as inmates got their balls removed so that Stanley could replace them with the balls of a dead guy. The reason was that Stanley thought that he could change and reform inmates by giving them the testicles of the dead. He even thought that this could reverse the aging process. Stanley didn't stop with testicles. He also took out the testicles of certain prisoners he thought were unworthy of reproduction, claiming that it was his way to improve the human race. But nothing came out of his experiments except for people with mutilated balls. Manhattan Project radiation experiments. The Manhattan Project is still one of the biggest weapons development projects in the history of mankind because it changed the world in many ways. But behind the Manhattan Project curtain are experiments that were just as questionable as the decision to bomb Japan twice. So when scientists were still perfecting the atom bomb, they were also interested in knowing how the radiation would affect people. That was when they conducted a series of medical experiments on humans, such as the case of Eb Cade, a construction worker who got hospitalized from a car accident. While he was in the hospital, he was injected with plutonium so that scientists could tell how the radioactive material would affect him. Cade wasn't aware of what was happening to him because the scientists never informed him about the potential risks. These scientists were like, "Consent? Never heard of it." Cade was just one of the people experimented on. He soon died of heart failure after leaving the hospital without knowing what the scientists did to him. There were some cases where the scientists fed radioactive materials to patients, all for the sake of gathering data on how human tissues and organs were affected by radiation. But they didn't care about the fallout because all they cared about was that the people working on the atom bombs were safe. Gender reassignment study. Put yourself in a boy named David Reimer's shoes. You were just 6 months old when your parents brought you in for a circumcision, only for the procedure to go wrong when it burned your Johnson. Of course, this led to Reimer losing his manhood, forced to live his entire life without his wiener. But his parents didn't want him to feel sad growing up without being able to experience things like peeing properly or even sex. That's when they approached Dr. Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University. Money, who believed that gender is based on nurture rather than nature, thought that it was a good idea for David's parents to raise him as a girl. Sounds familiar, right? That's because more people believe in this concept now compared to when David was still just an infant. So David underwent surgery to construct female genitalia, successfully becoming Brenda. While the medical experiment was supposed to prove Dr. Money's theory that gender was fluid, David never identified himself as a girl, suffering from depression because he felt different. The experiment affected David's mental health, even though it took him 14 years to learn that he was a boy. After learning the truth, he returned to being a man, but was never truly happy. David took his own life, sadly, at the age of 38. So while many liberal-minded people still believe that gender is fluid, David's case is an example of how forced gender reassignment can psychologically affect a person. Little Albert experiment. You don't give your baby a rock to hug. Instead, you give them a soft blanket or a stuffed toy, because babies and fluffy things go together like salt and pepper. But John B. Watson had one of the craziest ideas in the 1920s when he wanted to make a baby scared of fluffy things. Watson picked a baby named Albert, who was just like any other baby because he was happy-go-lucky. But Watson and his assistant changed all that. They showed him fluffy things like rabbits and a Santa mask, so naturally a baby would be drawn to stuff like that. But whenever Albert tried to reach to touch those fluffy things, Watson made a loud and scary noise behind him. This continued until the baby would no longer try to reach the fluffy thing out of fear. The mere sight of a rabbit was already terrifying enough for Albert. Watson essentially conditioned little Albert to get freaked out by fluffy things. The kid probably had nightmares of rabbits eating him alive. So if you have a grandpa named Albert who is afraid of rabbits and other fluffy things, he might have just been the kid from this psychotic experiment. Henrietta Lacks HeLa Cells experiment. You're Henrietta Lacks, and you want to go to the Johns Hopkins Hospital for cervical cancer treatment, believing that you're going to get the best and most ethical medical treatment of your life. But you're unaware of your role's importance in medical history. In the 1950s, Lacks was being treated for cancer, but doctors were taking cells from her tumor the entire time. These cells were dubbed HeLa cells, and they were like gold coins to scientists because of their invaluable role in medical research. Researchers were astounded when these cells reproduced at a rapid rate. The findings eventually allowed researchers to develop vaccines and have scientific breakthroughs for cancer. They also used the cells to test out whether or not certain cosmetics would be harmful to the skin. At first, the study sounded good and all because it helped a lot of research, but the problem was that Henrietta didn't know anything about it. She succumbed to cancer, all while doctors were studying her cells. But neither she nor her family ever gave doctors permission to harvest her cells. She was a guinea pig even after her death, making it clear that the doctor's methods lacked morality, regardless of how important the HeLa cells may have been to medical research. Head transplant experiments. You wake up in a dark room not knowing what happened the night before. As you come to your senses, you realize something unnatural is happening, like you're not in your body. Your hands feel different, and you suddenly see that you're walking and moving in someone else's body because some mad scientist transplanted your head to another person in one of the weirdest experiments ever. You've probably heard of the infamous dog head transplant experiments conducted in the Soviet Union. The goal was to prove that transplanting a head on another dog's body would show that the body would react positively to the new head and provide it with a blood supply. However, these dogs died shortly after, with the longest surviving for 29 days. So while it was already creepy enough that they did the experiment on dogs, these scientists thought the same thing could happen to humans. Researchers started looking at ways on how to use the same procedure on people, believing that a successful head transplant could save or extend a person's life. Essentially, you're moving a Lego head to another body after your dog chewed through the old one. While the experiments never happened on actual humans, the 21st century allowed doctors to find a way to transplant a human head on a corpse successfully. It's a step closer to some Frankenstein-level medical procedure in the future, but while a head transplant may sound like a breakthrough, the thought of waking up in another person's body is still one of the most terrifying things you can think of. Robber's Cave experiment. It's the summer of the 1950s, and you're one of the 22 boys taken to a summer camp in Oklahoma in what you thought would be a fun time with your friends. But psychologist Muzafer Sheriff thought it would be a good idea to experiment with these boys, splitting them into groups called the Eagles and the Rattlers. Under normal circumstances, this doesn't sound too bad, but Sheriff must have thought to himself, this is kind of boring. I want to see some real drama. He created competition between the two groups by giving special prizes and territories. It soon became a battle of pride between the Eagles and the Rattlers, as these boys started showing animosity and prejudice toward each other. While these boys were fighting for bragging rights, Sheriff was just chilling in his cabin, taking notes while observing the drama unfolding. The boys refused to work or eat with people from the other group. Sheriff's psychological experiment turned into an all-out gang war between the Bloods and the Crips. It became so intense that the 22 boys became completely divided, forcing some of the researchers to step in as referees to make sure things didn't escalate escalate beyond control, mentally and psychologically affecting how these kids saw differences between various social groups. If you're looking to become a part of a group of like-minded people, we suggest joining our Discord. We promise that we won't force you to fight with another group of people for the sake of a social experiment. CIA Project Artichoke. It's the 1950s and you're a homeless veteran still struggling with life after the war. Things may be bad on your end, but at least you're surviving. But the CIA suddenly plucks you out of the streets to take you to a secret facility together with prisoners and other homeless dudes. You're all there for Project Artichoke, a medical experiment meant to control your mind. You're suddenly in a cold room, strapped to a chair, while men in lab coats talk about ways to get into your mind. The thing is that they don't want any information because they just want to know how to make your will bend to theirs in a sinister and terrifying experiment. So what happens is that the CIA just pumps you full of drugs, like LSD, to get your mind all woozy. They also try to use hypnosis and other similar things to try to control it. It became a roller coaster ride of drugs and psychological manipulation for your brain for the sake of the CIA's mission to find out how the brain works. The subjects who left the project developed amnesia, leaving their memories of what happened to them during the project foggy. Harvard's psilocybin project. As you enter the halls of Harvard University, you say to yourself, you've made it in life. You believe you're on your way to success after getting accepted into one of the best schools in the world. It's also the 60s, meaning that life is groovy, colorful, and fun while you're in college. But then some professor talks about a medical experiment that you found interesting. Suddenly, this experiment changes your life. Called the Harvard Psilocybin Project, this experiment was all about learning how psychedelics can affect the way the mind works. Doctors were trying to discover how these mind-bending substances could alter how you perceive colors and hear sounds. But it wasn't just about your senses, because the doctors wanted to see how these drugs could be used to expand consciousness and possibly treat psychological disorders. So you signed up for the experiment, thinking nothing could go wrong. After all, it's Harvard, right? Next thing you know, you're swallowing a capsule full of psilocybin down your throat as the doctor tells you to prepare for the wildest ride of your life. From there, you start hallucinating, seeing things that aren't there, and hearing sounds that should only exist in your imagination. You might even see visions of your deepest fears, like your mom driving past McDonald's, telling you that you have McDonald's at home. Some subjects came out enlightened, feeling like they just discovered the secrets behind the universe. However, others were psychologically traumatized by the experiment, experiencing long-term anxiety, paranoia, and psychological damage. These results forced the experiment to shut down. Well, so much for Harvard giving you the best years of your young life. Tusco the Elephant Experiment. In 1962, the researchers over at the University of Oklahoma were curious about the effects of LSD. Of course, they already knew what it could do to humans, because the 60s were all about people using LSD and other psychedelics. So instead of looking at what this drug could do to humans, they used it on an elephant instead. Tusco, a 14-year-old male elephant, became the subject of this study out of the scientists' curiosity. The thing is that, unlike humans, Tusco couldn't give his consent to this study. Even if he could say no, it's not like the scientists could understand elephant language. So during the study, the scientists gave Tusco 3,000 times the typical human dose of LSD. Their goal was to see if they could use LSD to induce must, which is a state of high aggression and high sexual activity in male elephants. Instead of becoming sexual, Tusco collapsed and went into convulsions. He started showing signs of distress, forcing the researchers to use any kind of treatment to try to revive him. However, nothing worked. Tusco died a few hours after he was dosed with LSD. The experiment highlighted many problems. First, Tusco was given a ridiculously high dosage that wasn't scaled properly to his size. Second, it raised concerns regarding the treatment of animals in medical research. Green Run Test. Just a few years after World War II, the United States was a bit concerned about what could happen if another country nuked them, just like what they did to Japan when they dropped 2 bombs on them. So they decided to simulate similar conditions to what could possibly happen in case of a nuclear attack. This medical experiment, called the Green Run Test, involved releasing radioactive elements into the atmosphere. It was called Green Run because the materials used in this test were still green or highly radioactive. As such, they knew how dangerous these substances were when they released them into a testing site. The scientists wanted to track how the radioactive elements dispersed in the air, hoping to gather data that could help them develop safety measures and improve nuclear weapon development. But the locals near the testing site didn't know they had become victims of a medical and scientific experiment. The test released a lot of radioactive iodine-131 substances, which can cause thyroid cancer. Cancer rates increased among the people living in this nearby locality. It wasn't until decades later that these tests became public, prompting the government to compensate the affected people for their deteriorated health.